Today, you find me on the sunny Upleys marshes just north of Faversham. And today we're going to be talking about one of the worst explosions at a munitions factory in British history. We'll talk about what happened, why it happened, the aftermath, and why the UK government kind of hushed it up at the time. If you're new to the channel, I'm Tom. I'm not a historian, just a guy with a camera who likes finding interesting stories. And then, if possible, going to where those stories happened. So without further ado, this is the Faversham Gunpowder Explosion. During World War I, Britain's demand for high explosives skyrocketed. Obviously, it turns out bombs were pretty important when you're in a huge world war. And the explosives loading company at Upleys, just north of Faversham, was one of several sites producing TNT and Amatol shells that were being sent off to the front lines. Now, Faversham has quite a long history with gunpowder. In fact, in 1786, there were 3 gunpowder factories in and around the town. But things really kicked off in 1846 because of the discovery of gun cotton, which was, pretty much the first high explosive. And the first gun cotton plant in the world opened at the Marsh Works, which was one of the 3 gunpowder factories. That was, however, closed after another huge explosion on the 14th of July, 1847. Then, 1873 rolled around and the Cotton Powder Company moved in. They built a factory on the Upleys marshes, which at first you may think, well, that's remote, why build a factory there? But actually, when you were building explosives factories, remoteness was probably a good thing. And also it was alongside the Swale, which meant it had convenience for shipping. The only problem with building all of these factories in this remote location was the fact that they were built on saltings, which meant it wasn't really good for growing a lot, and especially not good for growing trees or shrubbery, which on a lot of explosive sites was used to actually protect buildings from, at this point, basically the inevitable explosions that were going to take place. You'd rather have a bunch of trees taking the impact of that rather than your other buildings. By 1915, the year before this disaster, the premises occupied a 500-acre site where they produced gun cotton, distress signals, detonators, nitroglycerin compounds like cordite, gelignite, and dynamite. Just to put into perspective just how big this site was, let's take a map of the City of London and let's just move it over the top of Upleys. This site, used pretty much just for making bombs, was almost as big as the City of London. And by this point, both the Cotton Powder Company and the Explosives Loading Company were a huge employer, not just of men from Faversham, but men from the local coastal towns as well. And they were very popular because those that worked there were given danger pay. You're working with essentially bombs, so getting a little bit extra because you might get blown up, it was quite attractive for some people. And there was also the fact that they were exempt from being enlisted, which did raise rather strong feelings in Faversham, with a lot of people basically feeling like hundreds of young men were hiding from the war. Which may technically have been the case for some, but they were still doing a very important job, and a very dangerous job, as we will see. Now, the Explosives Loading Company site at the time had about 30 buildings on it. Most were lightly constructed of wood, and they were very well spaced out. Again, to try and reduce any damage from any potential accidents. Welcome to Oare Nature Reserve, which is actually not where I'm supposed to be at all. I'm trying to get to Upleys Marshes, which are just around the corner from here, but when I say just around the corner, I mean, it's another long walk. But hey, that's all part of the fun. Now, where we're trying to go at Upleys Marshes is where the site of the Explosives Loading Company used to be. And we're going to go and find out if there's any sign of the factories, the buildings that used to be there, or even evidence of the explosion itself. This place used to be a hive of activity. Factories, gunpowder works spread over a huge area, and now it is just beautiful marshland and a lot of bird watchers. It is fascinating seeing all of these little reminders, these little memories of everything that used to be here. It's just, behind me over there, the remains, or the wooden remains, of a jetty going out onto the Swale. And then it's hard to make out through the undergrowth, but little hints of old buildings or foundations, what remains of some of the factories that were spread out across this whole area. Here's where we come to building number 833. This building was licensed for the storage of TNT, it had matchboard walls, and it stood about 50 feet away from a boiler house, which had 3 flues, which were each equipped with spark arresters, which could potentially have played a big role in what was to come. Now at this point they were in the throes of war. The factory was being worked incredibly hard, massively overtime, to create the vast quantities of TNT and explosives needed for the war effort. And during March of 1916, no less than 250 tons of TNT and ammonium nitrate had been delivered. And so this stuff was stacked everywhere. It was more material than they had the capacity to work, so it ended up piling up in and around these buildings. And on the night before the disaster, 2 patrolmen on the site reported that sparks had started a small fire between the boiler house and building number 833, but they'd managed to put it out. Now the weather at this time had been incredibly wet, but by the time the morning of Sunday the 2nd of April came around, the weather was glorious, incredibly warm and dry. Sorry to interrupt the video, this is just me asking that if you've enjoyed it so far, whether you'd be so kind as to press the subscribe button and like the video, because that really honestly tells me whether people actually enjoy watching these. And it helps give me the fighting spirit to help making this kind of stuff. Anyway, you would make my day if you did that. Back to Up Please. Well, some sheep just scared the living shit out of me. They're all in the long grass down there behind me. It's a bit like something out of The Lost World, where the raptors attack. When I arrived here, it was just me and a huge gaggle of bird watchers. Now it's just me and the dragonflies and the raptor sheep. Okay, I think that as I come along here, I am crossing into the section of this whole site that used to be the explosives loading company. And already I can see a huge concrete platform over there. There's a couple of ruined buildings behind me. Literally just rubble left over. So here we are. It was about 12 and a lot of the staff had gone on their lunch, when one employee, a Mr. Underwood, he noticed that some of the TNT bags stacked against the wooden wall of building number 833 had caught fire. He immediately raised the alarm and the works fire brigade were called. At the same time, the Cotton Powder Company's fire brigade were called out as well, just to make sure that they really had this in control. A young man called Stephen Epps, who was a member of the CPC brigade and had only been married 3 months earlier, was one of those firefighters who went to assist. Steve Epps and the other firefighters abandoned their lunch and dashed off to help. But by the time they arrived, the fire had spread from the sacks outside to everything inside the building. At this point, it was too late to put the fire out, and so they had to decide what to do with the material. Remember, the tons and tons and tons of TNT which were stacked everywhere. Obviously, they couldn't do nothing, so the decision was made to try and move all of these boxes of TNT away before the fire spread to them. At this point, they gathered as many staff and firefighters as possible and were moving boxes of TNT as quickly as they possibly could. Steve Epps said,
"We was chucking it to one side, handing it down. It kept falling all around about you, and they were slamming it round, and one old chap, he could see I was a bit nervy. He said, 'No, that won't go off unless it's detonated, old chap.' And I said, 'Right, I feel safe enough.'"
While everybody was moving this TNT, the firefighters continued to try and put out the fire. But all they had were buckets of water that they had to collect from a nearby dike. And they essentially formed a chain of firefighters moving the water along the chain to the fire. Let's just say it wasn't the most efficient way to put out a fire. Eventually, about 200 men were involved in these efforts, made up of the different fire brigades and the military men who were on site. You had men fighting the fire, men moving boxes. It was chaos. And on top of that, you then just had other employees who arrived to see what was going on and ignored instructions to get out of the way and just watched. And some have said that an over-familiarity with explosives, remember these people were working with them day in, day out, may have led to their inaction, their seeming unawareness of the risk that they were facing. By about 1:20 p.m, about 70 minutes after the fire had first been reported, it happened.
We just got the water on it, and up she went.
Building 833, still full of TNT and ammonium nitrate, exploded. Another employee, a George Goldfinch, who had run over to help in any way he could, was running towards the building when the explosion occurred. According to his report, the next thing he remembered was finding himself on the other side of the water and seeing the man quite near him with all his clothes blown off him, and just his shoes and socks, and his collar at a strange angle round his neck. As far as his own clothes were concerned, they were in tatters. He'd broken an arm and had various other injuries. He'd also been rendered partially deaf, and would remain that way for the rest of his life. The explosives contained in Building 833 amounted to at least 75 tons of high explosive, and the force of the explosions that followed was incredible. About half a mile from the centre of Norwich, 90 miles away, 14-year-old Stephen Tuck was having lunch with his parents at their home, when all of a sudden, a sash window began to rattle. According to what he said, he remembered looking up and seeing it shake violently. Also in Norwich, a man named William Stowers heard the sound of a distant explosion. At St Olave's near Great Yarmouth, a young girl called Dorothy Smith heard a huge bang. And doors and windows nearby rattled. And in Essex, the cross fell off the altar at St Peter's Church in Shoebury. And in Southend, which was separated from Upleys by the whole of the Isle of Sheppey, windows were blown out and 2 large plate glass shop windows were smashed. And there is some theorising as to why this explosion was heard so far away, which ranged from the shock travelling literally through the bedrock to the sound of the explosion actually reflecting off of the lower atmosphere. A member of the volunteer fire brigade, Sidney Wilson, recollected his experience.
As we passed through Oare village and came up on the Upleys road overlooking the factories, a second terrific explosion occurred, and my only recollection of it really is seeing a fan of flame.
Almost at the same moment that building number 833 exploded, another 2 process houses about 120 yards away also exploded. These were on the Cotton Powder Company's site and were full of nitroglycerin. These first 3 explosions were followed by 2 more, with another building exploding at 1:40 p.m, and then 20 minutes later, another, this building having been set on fire by debris from the previous explosions. The damage was huge. Of course, of the 5 buildings that blew up, nothing was left, and the first explosion from building 833 left a crater roughly 150 feet in diameter and about 15 feet deep, and almost everything around for about 225 yards had been destroyed. Remember, most of these buildings were lightly built of wood in case of just such an occasion. All the while through this, the fire brigades were still trying to put out the multiple fires that started because of the explosions. Our firefighter, Steve Epps, was the only survivor from a party of 7 who had been closest to building 833. When the explosion occurred, he was blown into a dike, and a piece of timber landed on top of him, and he was essentially left for dead, and only eventually being taken to hospital after people noticed that he was still alive, and he ultimately stayed in hospital for 19 weeks. Afterwards, he recollected,
"When my wife came to the hospital for the first time, she didn't recognise me. My sister went to the hospital that Sunday night, and the Monday and the Tuesday and the Wednesday, and she didn't recognise me either. She thought to herself, my brother's dead. Then she realised there was one who might be me. She told my wife that the nurses wanted her to go to the hospital to make sure, so she went. Of course, I'd got a broken thigh bone, a broken jaw, 4 broken ribs. I'd lost the use of my arm and the hand on the side where my ribs had been broken. My wife kept looking at me and kept thinking, is it Steve or isn't it? because she couldn't really recognise me properly. And then at last she looked again and she said, "Yes, that is him." And they said to her, "We're ever so sorry, but we haven't touched him yet, because we didn't expect him to live."
All the while rescue efforts were being made and people were still fighting these fires, the risks cannot be underestimated. There were still minor explosions occurring all over the place. And just nearby on the Cotton Powder Company's site, there were 3,000 tons of gun cotton. And if that had gone up, it would have wiped out everything. And as the rescue efforts continued, many victims were found still alive but on fire. It just cannot really be explained how difficult and chaotic a situation this was.
It is crazy being here and having read some of the eyewitness accounts, because you just look at what are clearly the remains of some of the old dikes that used to run through here, and then you read the stories about the bodies that were found in them, and our survivor Steve Epps being thrown into one. It's just hard to imagine looking at it now, the amount of carnage, the fires, the bodies, body parts everywhere, and then juxtaposition with it now. Just quiet, grazing cows. You know, it doesn't get much more peaceful than this.
A Dr. Evers recorded his own experience of arriving after the first explosion. He reported that he could see
a tremendous volume of flames and smoke.
And as he approached the factory, the second explosion occurred.
There was a tremendous burst of flame, followed by what seemed ages long and appalling report.
As him and his driver made their way further towards the scene, he reported,
"A continuous stream of injured men were dribbling in, pitiable objects. Some had been blown into dikes and were wringing wet and shivering with shock. Many were shaking all over. Some were brought on trolleys, some carried, some helped along. One man cheerfully proclaimed that he had a broken leg. Others were bleeding, and some had half their clothes torn off or burnt off. An awful procession. Even then, we did not realize the full extent of the disaster, as we had not penetrated to the heart of things, and could do no more than attend to those who kept coming up, faster than we could deal with them. We had not time to realize that behind that curtain were the worst stricken men, who could only be moved very slowly, and a number that need never be moved at all, for no help could restore them. 5 of the National Reserves who were on guard were killed instantly. Of one, nothing but his rifle was ever found. The vagaries of the explosion were many. 2 men side by side, one killed instantly, the other hardly hurt. A number of men between 30 and 40 yards away from the explosion unharmed, while men 100 yards away were blown to pieces. Men had had all their clothes blown off them, and were yet unhurt.
There were so many dead that a vast mass grave had to be dug at Faversham Cemetery.
And this is Faversham Cemetery, which is where the dead will laid to rest, or at least most of them. Now I'm going to see if I can find it. Okay, this was not difficult to find. It is huge.
And 1 whole week after the main funeral had taken place, another body was found in a ditch near the first explosion, and was later added to the mass grave.
Now, in this mass grave in front of me are 73 of the victims. 69 were buried initially, and more were added over the coming days and weeks. And inscribed upon this mass grave are the names of the dead, roughly where their coffins were placed. And next to me here is a stone marked with the names of another 35 people who were buried elsewhere at the request of their families.
Of those buried, only 34 could be identified. Another 35 could not, although 5 of them were tentatively named. For those who could not be identified, the register simply records a male person unknown. 2 of the youngest victims were aged 17, and the oldest was 61. The vast majority of the dead were in their 30s or 40s. And despite a huge number of women working in munitions factories at the time, all of the dead were male, which is simply because the women did not work on Sundays. Interestingly, because of wartime censorship and, a general desire from the government to keep morale high, news coverage of this disaster was very limited. In fact, it wasn't until Wednesday the 5th of April that the Ministry of Munitions actually acknowledged that there had been a serious fire in a powder factory and reassured the public that it was purely accidental. The British government didn't exactly want to draw attention to, let's say, their industrial vulnerabilities. And this, as we've seen before with previous wartime tragedies that I've covered on this channel, is a very common thing. A lot of the time, the cost of complete transparency in these kinds of disasters is weighed against the hit to morale. And generally speaking, morale always seems to win out. And it's only much later on that the full cost of these tragedies can really be measured. But that doesn't mean that locally, the grief of this wasn't overwhelming. A lot of workers obviously came from Faversham, and the local community there were devastated. Now, during the inquiry, 4 possible ways the TNT bags could have caught fire were identified. The first option was somebody had thrown a cigarette end or a glowing match onto the pile. The second was that the bags could have ignited spontaneously because of the previous wet and now incredibly hot weather. The third was somebody could have deliberately lit them on fire. And the fourth was a spark from the nearby boiler house could have set light to the sacks. Of those 4 possibilities, the first 3 were almost immediately discounted. Safety measures were such that no matches could be brought into the factory and smoking was only allowed in certain areas. And people were unlikely to mess with these rules because the punishments were severe. Spontaneous ignition was pretty much written off as improbable because, it usually is, it does happen, but most of the time there's a more straightforward cause. As for somebody deliberately setting light to the sacks, there was simply no evidence. And the fact that there was a military guard of 128 men with another 28 patrolmen, it was considered very unlikely that an intruder could have made their way through the site and set fire to these sacks. Add to that the fact that everybody was surprised that these sacks being on fire led to the massive explosions that took place. Any would-be saboteur probably wouldn't have set a fire there. As Major Cooper Key said during the inquiry,
"No one could have foreseen that the ignition of these bags would have had such serious consequences."
And so the only remaining option was a spark from the boiler house. And when we consider those 2 patrolmen who had spotted a fire that had started because of sparks from the boiler house the night before, this really seems like the only probable cause. Now, ultimately, after this inquiry, a verdict of accidental death for every one of the victims was returned, and thus the management were acquitted of all blame. Now, I don't know about you, but I feel like maybe somebody was to blame here, because if it was sparks coming from the nearby boiler house, then this was either faulty equipment or a poor placement of buildings, assets, whatever. It really feels like this also fell under this government cover-up. We don't want to ruffle too many feathers during a time of war. We still need these factories to be making munitions for us, so everybody just carry on as normal. As for the reason the building exploded the way it did, unexpectedly, the inquiry determined that it was the combination of TNT and ammonium nitrate being stored together that created the circumstances for an explosion to happen. And ultimately the inquiry led to several recommendations. They recommended that boiler houses be kept as far away as possible from dangerous buildings. Plenty of buckets filled with water needed to be available in all buildings, with proper fire hydrants provided where possible. Part-time works fire brigades had to be formed and trained by qualified firemen in the use of the various appliances at their disposal. Accumulations of empty boxes, bags, refuse, or any inflammable substances was forbidden. Stocks of explosives or their ingredients, where proper storage was not available but still had to be kept on site, were to be placed as far away as possible from buildings. TNT and ammonium nitrate were never to be stored together in the same building again, and all conditions and terms of licenses had to be strictly adhered to, regardless of how busy they were. And the last recommendation
was that if a fire in a munitions factory could not adequately be put out with buckets in a reasonable amount of time, then everybody was expected to draw away to a safe distance.
And the awful thing about this is that this explosion was not an isolated incident. During the First World War, hundreds of munitions workers were killed in similar accidents across Britain. It seemed that the rush to produce as many munitions as possible for the war effort was on a lot of occasions just too much too soon, and resulted in many similar explosions and more death. And oftentimes these are the casualties forgotten during war. The men and women who never actually went to the front line, who never actually set foot on a battlefield, but were still at home helping the cause and ultimately still sacrificed their lives.
As usual, this serves as a stark reminder that even if we couldn't really find much evidence of this disaster at Uplea's Marshes, where it happened, it survives here in Faversham Cemetery. And ultimately, it's another reminder that these huge accidents, just because they took place during a time of war, get buried in everything else that's happening. Whereas if these had happened outside of a time of war, these would be huge disasters and they'd be remembered forever. Whereas they tend to be a little forgotten and obviously kind of covered up to a certain extent at the time. Can kind of understand why, but that doesn't change the fact that it must have been heartbreaking for the family members of the victims of this tragedy. And you'd hope they can be remembered with the same amount of honour and respect as soldiers who died on the front lines. Well, that's about all we have time for today from sunny Faversham. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. Remember to like, subscribe, comment if you've enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.